We're here to gain a little bit of insight from our Master Creative Director, AshleyBall, who is a writer and a singer and a musician and all kinds of great things. So with that, Ashley, I'd like to have you introduce yourself.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you all for joining us. My name is AshleyBall. I've been in this business since 1988. Got my first job at the age of 6. So you can do those numbers and work that out. But I worked in various agencies in Sydney and Australia, and then lucky enough to marry an Oklahoman lady that brought me here to Oklahoma. And my very first job here was with Ackerman McQueen at the end of 2002, and I've been here ever since. So it's a number of years. I joined the agency as a creative director, and that role has changed and become far broader, I think, than it was in those days, because of the agency and the changes that we have brought about in the way that we work and what we do in the place. So it's a very different place than it was, but then there's a lot of things that do remain the same.
So what you do is you find a way to tell stories, and telling a story is one of those things that sometimes it's a flash of brilliance, and other times it is a struggle to find that voice. So tell us a little bit about how do you find that voice?
The stories start with the strategy, and that's, this is, after all, this is a business where artistic people get to be employed, but it still has to be a business. And so there's a reason for being for every piece that we do, and the reason for being will always work its way back to the brand that is presenting that message. And so you really start with that. You've got to work out exactly what it is that you want to say or what the story is that you want to tell before you begin. And then the inspiration for the stories either comes from yourself and from your collaborators when you're talking about how do we get this message across. That's particularly more perhaps in the scripted stories, the 30-second commercials, the very clear corporate messaging. On the other hand, when it comes to the documentary making, those stories are kind of waiting there to be plumbed, and you have to connect with the person that you're talking to in a very intimate way, which is difficult to do. But when you get somebody to relax on camera and to be able to explore their world with them, that's when those stories come up, and that's when you know as you're speaking to them that you've got something there, and then you start to chase it while you're talking to them. And generally there are other interviews around that anchor interview that will give you that story. So two quite different forms of storytelling, and in between there's a whole bunch of other types.
Outside of production, though, before we get to production, you have to create a concept. You have to sit down and say, this particular piece is going to be X, whether it's going to be a narrative or if it's going to be an interview process, or if it's going to be a fully scripted piece that you'll put music to. When you are going through that process, how do you determine what it's going to be? And then once you do that, you have to sell it, and we have to make sure that it can be billable.
Yeah, I think every piece of communication that we set out to create needs to have something that causes someone to have a thought process. That is how you get into somebody's mind, is that you supply them with something that makes them think, whether it takes them in a self-examining journey, whether they get a joke, whether they latch onto a piece of music because it's catchy, whether they get taken on an emotional journey. That's where you've got to take them, and how to do that comes upon you in all sorts of different ways. As David Lipson said, the joy of writing is staring at a blank piece of paper until drops of blood fall onto the paper. So sometimes it really is just stretching that out for days and weeks before anything will come. Other times, inspiration will appear in the middle of the night or when you're in the shower. I've written jingles in the shower. But you have to be committed to it, and you have to be tuned into it. Things don't just appear out of the air. You have to say, okay, I'm working now, even if you are in the shower. Okay, I've got 15 minutes to think about this. I'm going to come up with something. So.
When you're doing an interview, is there one recently that you've done that has been particularly evocative, something that really struck you as being special?
Every one of them is special in a way, because, wow, here's somebody who's willing to open up their life to you. What I try to do is I try to get to know the person, even if it's so briefly, just to have a few minutes with them beforehand. Always make it feel really natural. I think when you give people planned questions, they tend to script it for themselves, and you can tell that on camera. So really, I try to go in with a blank canvas, try and get to know what the person is into, and then that's kind of your entry point, because most people love to talk about themselves. I think you've got to be very respectful, and you really do let people tell their own stories without guiding them too much. I mean, recently I was fortunate enough to interview the mayor of Fort Smith. I just sat back and listened, really. It was so wonderful to hear him just riff on his city, and you could see why he was a consummate politician. He had just had me. I was ready to move to Fort Smith. We were going to have Ackerman McQueen Fort Smith set up. I was ready to go. So he was wonderful. Again, and so that Fort Smith piece, you guys can see that on OGE Together right now. It's definitely worth looking at. And another piece that we've just finished for Connections, Integris, a young lady who was struck down by just about every possible imaginable infection that you could have. She was on this treatment that most people are on for 2 weeks to keep them alive. She was on it for 119 days. And so talking to her and seeing this incredible life force, an amazing interview, very, very powerful. And both of those pieces for two amazing interviews that turned into amazing stories. Yeah.
So the future of writing, do you ever concern yourself with the thought that with all of the advancement in technologies that writing from a human standpoint is going to change? Do you think it's possible that computers will eventually just take over all writing and it not be a humanistic element?
I don't think so. I think, AI is going to continue to develop, but I'm not sure it is ever going to be able to develop a soul. I'll be very impressed when it can. So I think writers per se are never going to go away. I think they're actually only going to become more powerful. I think finally the digital world is catching up to the fact that we still need soul in this stuff.
If anybody else has any other questions, you can find him on 22 in the corner. His furniture looks just like this.
Yeah.
And we thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been great.
Have a good day, guys.